For nearly 30 years, Interstate 10 had a hole in it, and the strange part was not that the highway was unfinished, it was where it was unfinished. This wasn't a gap in the terrain that had beaten the engineers. That missing piece sat in the middle of Phoenix. The problem was not whether Arizona could build a freeway, but whether Phoenix was willing to live with the one the state wanted to build. The original answer was to carry a freeway high above downtown. Near Central Avenue, the 25-foot high elevated road would climb to nearly 100 feet, about the same size as a 10-story building. Then it would send traffic down huge spiral ramps on a drawing board that looked like a clever way to move cars through a crowded city, almost a space-age piece of engineering. For the people who lived there, it wasn't so impressive, and that's where the fight began. It became what was known as one of the first freeway revolts, a pushback from angry citizens that also had the backing of the local newspapers, fueling an outcry against what they were calling the 100-foot high mistake. The good news is they won, but the bad news is they also lost. For several years prior, the state had been buying up right-of-way and demolishing homes and neighborhoods. Now that the proposal was canceled, the city was left with an ugly 10-mile scar, and due to its massive growth, nowhere else really to put Interstate 10. So a compromise finally emerged, one that would send the traffic underground, not in a traditional tunnel, but a trench. One that was capped off with no fewer than 19 pre-stressed concrete bridges set edge to edge, and a city park placed on top. Construction began in the 1980s, but little did the city that feared being buried beneath the highway know they would unearth another already buried by theirs. Well, my name is Scott, and today we're taking an Engineering the Impossible look at Phoenix's unique fix, one that took almost 30 years to finish a single mile of Interstate 10. This is the Papago Freeway and the Deck Park Tunnel. Let's go beyond the exit. The Papago Freeway came out of an era when highways were often treated as proof that a city was moving forward. In the 1950s and 60s, the interstate system was sold to the country as progress, better roads, safer travel, faster freight, and family vacations. Growing cities, of course, and the underlying need for a high-speed defense network, all of it pointed in the same direction. A modern America needed modern highways, and a modern city was expected to make room for them. Well, that message showed up in more than just engineering reports. It could be found in public films, planning brochures, school materials, and the general language of the time. Highways were presented as normal, necessary, and even exciting. The harder question, the one that often came later, was what happened when the national promise reached a real neighborhood. In Phoenix, that intersection, or collision in this case, came from a segment known as the Moreland Street Corridor. Just north of downtown, it included locations such as the Garfield, Francis Quarles Story, and the Willow neighborhoods. Beginning around 1960, the state started acquiring land for the future freeway, and that began cementing the corridor before the first finished lanes ever reached it. So everyone kind of sat back and waited for the dust to settle. However, when the final state plan was presented, no one could have anticipated that proposal. Near Central Avenue, the freeway would rise close to 100 feet above downtown, then bring traffic down through huge spiral ramps called helicoils, each of them nearly 2,000 feet long, dropping at a 5% grade, covering 360 degrees of travel. From edge to edge on the outside, the entire intersection was over 800 feet wide. To highway planners and state officials, it was seen as an engineering design marvel, solving an urban problem by simply flying over it. But for those living in its path, or more correctly, its shadow, it simply couldn't be allowed to fly. One of those people was Nina Mason Pulliam, wife of Eugene Pulliam, publisher of the largest newspapers in town. When the Arizona Highway Department finalized the architectural renderings and scale models of the proposed interstate, she was there for the unveiling and absolutely could not hide her dismay. Now, it should be noted that Nina wasn't just a publisher's wife, she was a fully accomplished journalist, not to mention a pilot and a sharp civic observer and advocate in her own right. Looking at the drawings, she was immediately horrified by the sheer scale of the concrete structures. It would permanently shadow, divide, and visually ruin the downtown core, effectively turning Phoenix into a concrete jungle. Juanita described everything to her husband and laid out exactly what this project would do to the city's landscape. She quickly convinced him that the highway department's plan wasn't progress. It was an urban planning disaster. Her intervention completely flipped Eugene Pulliam's stance. He weaponized the newspapers against the project, breaking ranks with the pro-freeway business elite. The Republic and the Gazette launched a relentless front-page editorial campaign. They published regular broadsides against the highway department, famously branding their design the 100-foot-high mistake, along with running illustrations that compared the proposed concrete pillars to the chaotic, smog-choked freeway systems of Los Angeles, a fate Phoenix residents desperately wanted to avoid. In May of 1973, Phoenix voters were asked to weigh in. The vote was advisory, so it didn't carry the same force as a binding cancellation, but the result left little room for pretending the public was undecided. The elevated freeway lost by roughly 3-1, so the concrete giant and helicoils were finished, at least as a serious path forward. However, what looked like an enormous victory also hid an immense loss. Even though the elevated plan was gone, Phoenix was still stuck with the same piece of ground. The state had spent years and millions of dollars preparing the corridor for this freeway. Due to that investment, they weren't about to relinquish it. But even if they had, the damage had pretty much already been done. Winning the fight didn't mean that they got their neighborhoods back, so it all sat vacant for nearly 2 more years. In 1975, an idea to bore tunnels underground were rejected also. Then a proposal for a trench dug through downtown was also met with a strong thumbs down. The final proposal, a compromise, combined both, a trench with a cap, which was still a tunnel of sorts. However, a green space and park would be created on top of it for all of the public to use. That compromise was accepted in 1979, and with the plan finally greenlit, Phoenix began construction on the last single mile of Interstate 10 not connected yet, only to have a new surprise stop them once again. When construction finally began in 1983, the project moved from politics into the dirt. After decades of drawings, votes, editorials, and empty lots, crews were finally digging the trench that would carry the freeway through central Phoenix. But almost as soon as the blades hit the dirt, the project ran into a city that had been buried there long before the interstate was even imagined. The obstacle under the freeway trench was called La Ciudad. The name, of course, translated from Spanish, means simply the city, and it was not just a poetic label. Long before Phoenix became Phoenix, the Salt River Valley had supported a massive desert civilization. The Hohokam built vast networks of gravity-fed irrigation canals, farmed the valley floor, and learned how to make this dry ground hold life in a way that is still shaping the region centuries later. When modern crews began cutting into the path of Interstate 10, they found they weren't digging in empty dirt. For the construction crews, it was quite a surprise, and the recovery effort instantly became a high-stakes emergency excavation. Contracted by the state, Arizona State University crews laid out the active right-of-way in hundreds of grid squares, cut deep test trenches, and open areas where the buried features were clustered. The final handoff between the two eras was immediate. Arizona State University archaeological teams spent their final shifts working straight through a Sunday. That Monday morning, the heavy bulldozers moved back on site to resume grading. The Papago Freeway moved forward, but only after crews took the limited time allowed to document the infrastructure the road was about to erase. And with this movement, construction resumed. Now, the plan was not to drill a tunnel through the ground in the conventional method. Phoenix was going to build it as a cut and cover. Crews would open up a corridor from above, excavate a deep trench through downtown, build Interstate 10 below street level, and then cover the most visible sections with a row of bridge structures. The future freeway trench had to be cut deep enough and wide enough to carry 10 lanes of traffic below the city streets around it. Crews removed nearly 1 million cubic yards of soil from the corridor, turning the old freeway footprint into an open cut through central Phoenix. Now, the trench itself was just shy of 3,000 feet between 3rd Street and 3rd Avenue. It was dug to a uniform depth of 30 feet to ensure vertical clearance for commercial truck traffic. To accommodate the 10 lanes of traffic, interior shoulders, and utility corridors, the width of the excavation varied from 150 feet to 250 feet, using vertical concrete slurry walls to stabilize the edges of the pit and protect the foundations of the remaining historic homes along the edge. Inside, workers poured roughly 1,400 reinforced concrete columns to carry the overhead load. Engineers rejected a single monolithic concrete roof, which would crack under the desert thermal expansion. Instead, they built the lid using 19 parallel pre-stressed concrete bridges placed side by side. Separated by deliberate expansion joints, these post-tension box girders shifted independently in the heat while spanning the wide traffic lanes without center support pillars. Now, we've covered pre-stressed concrete in another one of our videos back a few months ago in the Lake Pontchartrain Causeway video. We go into the complete detail and history of how it was developed and how it's still used in almost all concrete span bridges still today. We'll leave a link at the end of the video. As you can imagine, that was a lot of concrete. The project required nearly 100,000 cubic yards of it and nearly 20 million pounds of reinforcing steel. After waterproofing the decks and sealing all the joints, engineers had to address the weight of the surface landscape, which was being laid on top of it. Now, because wet soil would have been an extreme load over top of this structure and an engineered soil mixture made mostly of volcanic aggregate. When finished, this space was called the Margaret T. Hance Park, a dedication to Phoenix's first female mayor, who served from 1976 all the way through '84. It was only right since her administration was credited with securing federal money for the entire project. Underneath it all, the design successfully hid Interstate 10 from the downtown street grid. And in fixing what many thought was a major eyesore, it started another problem altogether. Now, putting I-10 below street level created a basic engineering problem. The freeway trench was the low point in town. Now, for someone considering this was in the desert, it might be a little bit of an overstatement, but from June until September every year, Phoenix sees torrential rains. And because most of the surrounding soil is baked hard, it doesn't absorb water quickly. That leads to flash flooding. The tunnel project itself had also interrupted storm drains that already served downtown Phoenix, so Arizona DOT had to build a separate drainage system around the freeway itself. The system includes about 6.5 miles of underground drainage tunnels, roughly 5.2 miles of it at 21 foot in diameter, with another smaller one at 14 feet in diameter. To expel that literal river of water, several pumps capable of moving 32,000 gallons a minute were put in place. Now, to put that in perspective, that's 2 million gallons an hour, or the equivalent of draining a backyard in-ground swimming pool in about 30 seconds. It's extreme measure to make sure that everything stays dry. The tunnel itself, believe it or not, sees nearly 250,000 vehicles every day, which also means a lot of exhaust fumes as well. Now, unlike some of the long underwater tunnels that we've covered, the park deck tunnel's short length allowed it to be open on both ends and allow a good draw of air. Still, there had to be a way to ventilate it. Now, to accomplish that job, there are 8 massive fans distributed across 4 dedicated vent rooms, all hidden within Margaret T. Hance Park, directly above the highway. Now, they have the ability to draw or push enough air through the system to change the complete atmosphere in the tunnel every 5 minutes. But because the traffic load is so variable, at night when fewer vehicles pass through, natural vent may be enough to keep the tunnel at a safe carbon monoxide level. But as placed sensors recognize more traffic coming through, the variable frequency drive motors ramp up to 200, 500, or even 725 horsepower, making sure the tunnel stays safe and efficient. Its design also includes transitional lighting. Now, the idea was to make the entrance bright enough that drivers were not driving from blinding sunlight directly into total darkness. So the entrances start much brighter than the center of the tunnel as it steps down and then gradually brings itself back up again. It's key to driver safety and helping keep a 24/7 lighting system efficient and within its budget. And with all its amazing infrastructure hidden from the rest of the world, it's an entire system built underground. And yet tucked silently between the eastbound and westbound lanes was one more piece of the original plan, an expressway exclusively for bus traffic. There were pullouts for specific spots along the way, and disembarking passengers would then take escalators, stairs, and elevators up to the main level near the park. The only problem? The federal money promised to complete the connections was spent on cost overruns with the entire I-10 corridor. So inside the tunnel sits one of the stranger leftovers from the whole project, a 2-lane corridor built for a transit plan that never became a part of daily life in Phoenix. On August 10th, 1990, the tunnel was officially dedicated and then opened to the public. For Phoenix, it meant that the immense amount of traffic congestion through this area was pushed underground, traded for a beautiful green space that never recognizes the traffic flowing beneath it. For the rest of the country, it meant that the final mile of Interstate 10, after a long, nearly 30-year battle, the stalemate was finally over. You know, the Park Deck Tunnel handles nearly 100 million vehicles annually. With that many people passing through the tunnel, I can't help but imagine that they have several comments and stories, mile markers if you will, to be shared about it, and we would love to hear your stories. Please drop them in the comments below. That's one of the best things about our community here on the channel. So many people are able to share their stories and recollections, good and bad, for everyone to enjoy. Speaking of enjoyment, did you enjoy today's video? If so, if you don't mind, right now, please hit the like button or share it with a friend who might enjoy it too. You know, here on Beyond the Exit, we believe the highway is the hero of our story. If that's something you enjoy too, because we've already told a lot of stories, there's so many more to tell. Why don't you join us on our Beyond the Exit caravan? We'd love for you to hop in and ride along with us. And you know, YouTube can be a lot like a big interstate network as well. So we're really happy that you're here and went beyond the exit to spend a little time with us. As always, we want to thank you for watching and say God bless.